Hello film fans, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter, and I'm Aaron Hunter, and I'd like to show you a few images from a few different films. If you're anything like me, or if you're a fan or a longtime viewer of this channel, probably a lot of those images jumped right out at you, and even without the titles of the films, which I'll list all down below, you know what the films were, or you have at least the vague notion that I've seen that before, I recognize that. And what all those images have in common is that on all the films they come from, the cinematographer or director of photography was Owen Roizman, who passed away on the 6th of January at the age of 86. And I thought I'd just come on here, as I do once in a while, and say a few words about him, because he's one of the great cinematographers in American movie history. And as is often the case with practitioners like Roizman, who made some of the most indelible images in some of the greatest films of the last 60 years, they're often overlooked in favor of the directors and the cast or the stars. That's typically the case in Hollywood, and I mean, we all know this, but if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that I like to pay special attention to the non-directing practitioners, cinematographers, production designers, writers, sound designers, and so on. And Roizman is like the creme de la creme, the top of the heap. He's literally, like, I'm not exaggerating because the guy has passed away, literally one of the greatest cinematographers who ever lived. So I thought I'd just like pay him a little tribute here, and offer my condolences. Roizman was born in Brooklyn, where he grew up, and he doesn't come from a film, or he didn't, I should say, come from a film family necessarily. I think there was a photographer in his family, and maybe an editor, a TV editor, or something like that. He's not a Nepo baby, as the kids say today. I think he kind of came up on the streets of Brooklyn, but always interested in photography, also interested in sports. And he went to Gettysburg College, where he actually studied math and physics, I believe. And I think one of the interesting things that warms my heart as a teacher about that is that in later years, Roizman would say that he had no regrets about studying math and physics, because he learned from them. You know, he learned about angles, he learned about temperatures, he learned about light and color and all these sorts of things. Someone who teaches at a sort of liberal arts style school, yes, regardless of what you're studying today, it may help you in the future, however your life, whatever sort of twists and turns it may take. Anyhow, he came out of Gettysburg, his interest in filming and photography grew, and he got to start working in commercials in the 1960s. And he shot his first feature film in 1970. I've never seen this. It's a film called Stop that was directed by the kind of experimental theater and filmmaker Bill Gunn, the African-American filmmaker, who I have talked about before on the channel. I've done a whole video on what makes this film great about Ganja and Hess, which he made a few years after Stop. And of course, Bill Gunn wrote the script to The Landlord, Hal Ashby's first film, also in 1970. But Stop, because of its kind of experimental nature, its adult imagery, was rated X by the Motion Picture Association. This was back when they were still giving X's to non-pornographic films, like Midnight Cowboy, for example. But the distributor got cold feet. I think it was Warner Brothers, and they ended up not distributing it. And it's really hard to get. If anyone knows where I can see Stop, streaming or otherwise, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to see that film. But it's really Roizman's second film that kind of catapulted him into the stratosphere of cinematography, and that's the 1971 film The French Connection, directed by William Friedkin, starring Roy Scheider and Gene Hackman, among many others, which was a smash hit. It was a critical sensation. It turned William Friedkin into William frickin' Friedkin, one of the big filmmakers of the early 1970s. It turned Gene Hackman from a kind of character actor, side performer, into a mega star. It catapulted Roy Scheider's career. It won all the Academy Awards except cinematography. And it set Roizman on the path to steady, beautiful work that he would continue for another 20 years. It's important to note that while most of his kind of famous work happened in the 70s, he continued making a lot of great films into the 80s and 90s, and I'll come back to that in a minute. On The French Connection, he established already what became known as kind of his signature look, although his career was a lot more than that, which was a kind of gritty. You'll often hear him described as a gritty cinematographer, a cinematographer of the street, a poet of the street. And there's a lot of truth to that, and you see it in another one of his great films, The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, where he again captures a kind of gritty street level poetry, the subway, the lights of the subway, the lighting of that film is fantastic. They wanted to give French Connection a realistic feel. He's been very clear that they didn't want it to look like a documentary necessarily, but they wanted it to look real. They wanted to look, street level and real. So he worked really hard to create the appearance of natural light. For example, when he could shoot in the natural light or the existing light, as he did in that famous subway scene, the cat and mouse on the subway. He said in some close-ups for texture, he might bring in a very mild fluorescent light, but when he could, he only used the available light and natural light. And the other thing he did was to sort of play around with film exposure, both in the shooting of the film and later in the development of the film. And what he wanted to do, and what he did, was to create this kind of washed out gray. He said he wanted it to feel flat, which is really interesting to me because at the same time, people like Laszlo Kovacs, Gordon Willis were striving for depth. Laszlo Kovacs, especially in those huge depths of field that he gets in the Bogdanovich films. Same with Gordon Willis shooting those, really long takes, or the split diopter shots in the All the President's Men and so on. But what Roizman's going for here is what he called a flat feel, almost like a television feel. And what I find fascinating about this is I think you could argue that his photography on The French Connection set the standard for New York City photography for the next 10 or more years. And if you watch films through the rest of the decade, regardless of who's shot them, set in New York, they have that same feel. They're going for that gritty 70s New York look, and they apply this kind of Roizman washed out flat grayness that, in my mind, as someone who grew up in the 70s but didn't get to New York until 1990, that imagery of New York is in a lot of ways New York in my mind. And when I go to New York, I love it. It's a great place to walk around. There's so much to see movie-wise and otherwise. But when I see a 70s film set in New York, it's almost like I feel more connected to that filmic imagery of the city than I do actually going there. And Roizman created that look with Friedkin, of course. But that wasn't the only thing that he did. So you can look at films like The Exorcist. You can look at later films that he shot. You can look at films like Network. Yeah, he shot Network. But some of the films that he shot with Lawrence Kasdan, Wyatt Earp and Grand Canyon, which are just beautiful and lush, and the colors are gorgeous. You know, he was a cinematographer with a huge toolbox that he could deploy as the film needed. And he talks about this in interviews, that he used the tools necessary to that film. One of the things he says that I think is really great is he would meet with the director, they would talk about the look they were going for, and then he would go and visit the locations or the sets and see it how he wanted to see it, and then create that. If he needed a lot of lights, he used a lot of lights. If he needed minimal or no lights, he used minimal or no lights. It was all about creating the look and feel of the film that the director wanted, but it was Roizman who was doing it. And that's, you know, a supreme skill on the part of a cinematographer. The car chase in The French Connection, and William Friedkin, God love him, he's one of those 70s directors, he's had a much longer career of course, but he's one of those 70s directors who, the subject of every William Friedkin story is William Friedkin. And if you go and try to find how was the car chase sequence in The French Connection shot, a lot of what you're going to find online, whether it's on some movie page or somebody's cineblog or whatever it is a sort of recitation of a story that Friedkin likes to tell, which is that they were shooting the car chase and he was dissatisfied with it, so he got into the car with the driver and said, "I don't think you dare to drive through New York City properly." And Bill Hickey drove, 90 miles per hour through New York with no police, real traffic, while Friedkin was in the back filming the out through the windshield. That's true. That really happened. But if you watch the car chase sequence, that footage, which is in the film, is very little of the car chase. Most of the car chase sequence was actually meticulously planned beforehand, and it was shot over several days in the shooting. So they would decide on certain days when they had the street blocked off. They had it from, I think Friedkin once said, from 10 to 3 in between rush hour. And it was just one stretch underneath that elevated train in, I think it was in Queens where they filmed it, but it was meant to be set in Brooklyn. And they shot on different days. They had different stunts. They had to set up different stunts differently. The baby carriage is the most famous one. And they had a whole car rigged out. And you can see in these pictures, they built a rig. You can see how handmade this rig is. It's like wooden blocks nailed together in the back seat of the car, and there you get a lot of the over-the-shoulder shots of Hackman driving. So if Hackman's driving and you can see the side of his face, that's the camera rig in the back of the car. And if Hackman's driving and you see the side of his face, that's they also rigged up a camera on the front of the car to shoot inside and another camera on the front of the car to shoot forward. So a lot of the sequence that's filmed, or a lot of the sequences, or a lot of the footage, I should say, that's filmed of that sequence was planned beforehand, and Roizman was intimately involved in the planning and shooting of that sequence. And of course, Friedkin sat in the back and drove through the city 90 miles per hour with Hickey and got some of that footage as well. But Roizman, crafted a lot of it. Of course, a lot of it was done in the editing, a lot of it's sound design and things like that. But a lot of it is Roizman's work. One of my favorite films he shot, though, doesn't really have any of that gritty city. There's a little bit of New York City footage, but it's mostly the sunlight of Miami and the austere coldness of Minneapolis, and that's the Heartbreak Kid. And that has two of my favorite moments that Roizman filmed, and they both happen in the Miami Beach sequence. If you don't know about the Heartbreak Kid, it was actually the first video I did as part of Movie Talk. You can watch that here. I'd like to redo that someday. But it has three basic locations. The opening is in New York City, where this couple, Charles Grodin and Jeannie Berlin, meet and fall in love, and they get married, and then they drive down to Miami Beach for their honeymoon, and a long portion of the film is set in Miami Beach, where Charles Grodin meets Sybil Shepherd, falls in love with her, breaks off his marriage, and then chases Sybil Shepherd back to Minneapolis in winter, where it's snowy and cold. So you have these contrasting visuals, the big city of New York, the sun-dappled beaches and poolsides of Miami Beach, and then the austere, snowy coldness of Minneapolis. And Roizman captures all of those sequences beautifully and believably. Each one you feel like you're there, like sweating next to the pool and then freezing in the snow. But two of my favorite shots come early in the Miami Beach section. The first is when they first get there, and it's a really short shot, and it's this kind of awkwardly askew POV shot from Jeannie Berlin's point of view of the hotels as they're driving into Miami Beach. And the reason I love that shot is because it's a very subtle indicator, I think, that everything's about to get topsy-turvy in their lives, particularly in her life, because her husband's going to leave her. Her new husband's going to leave her. And then the second one, which is one of my favorite shots in the 70s, is Sybil Shepherd's first appearance on the beach.
That's my spot.
What? Excuse me?
I said you're lying in my spot.
This is your spot?
Everybody knows that.
I didn't.
I mean, he shoots her like she's an angel, and you have to understand as a viewer. I mean, I talk in the video about how horrible Lenny is, Charles Grodin's Lenny, but you have to understand why he would kind of throw over his wife, who he's just married, for this woman. And that appearance is a really important part of it. She's funny and cheeky in the way that she talks to him about taking her spot, but it's that halo and the lens flares. It's not just that she's well lit. I mean, the sun's doing a lot of the lighting, but that lighting is shot right. It's the beams of light coming off her. It's like she's this creature who arrives of beauty and love to thwart all of his plans and his whole life story. And just in that moment, I think the whole movie turns, and it's created for us by the cinematography. It's awesome. He, as I said, had a great career into the 80s and 90s. He shot the first Addams Family film. As I said, Wyatt Earp, beautifully shot film. I think later in his career, he went more increasingly for the stately shot, the painterly cinematography. And I don't know why, maybe because he was getting older, maybe because he'd been nominated for 5 Academy Awards and hadn't won one. Maybe he should have won some of those. Certainly The French Connection, that was its year. I had this here, I'll have a quick look. I think Fiddler on the Roof won the Academy Award. Yeah, Oswald Morris's cinematography. In the year of The Exorcist, for which he was also nominated, which is amazing how different the cinematography is in that film compared to French Connection, but I won't go into that. Sven Nykvist, Cries and Whispers, you know, that's incredible. And then one of my favorite, he lost one of my favorites, probably a friend of his, Haskell Wexler, Bound for Glory. That was the year he shot Network, which is incredible, but Bound for Glory, it's the first film with the Steadicam. It's amazing. And then he got nominated a few more times here, once for Tootsie, great film, which Haskell Wexler almost shot. That's a whole other story. Lost Out to Gandhi. Tootsie's beautiful film. But also Nestor Almendros was nominated that year for Sophie's Choice. Yeah, that's a tough one. And then his final nomination came in 1994 for Wyatt Earp, which he lost to John Toll for Legends of the Fall. Yeah, that was just one of those sort of zeitgeisty Brad Pitt movies, I guess. Years ago was awarded an honorary Academy Award, and I think that was in 2017. He also shot for television. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this, but I don't want to keep you all. In particular, the fantastic 1972 concert film Liza with a Z that was filmed by Bob Fosse, and it was this big production that Fosse and Liza Minnelli did after they made Cabaret, and Roizman was in charge of cinematography for that, nominated for an Emmy, which he also didn't win, unfortunately. But he really was an integral part of the 1970s New Hollywood reimagining of what American film could look like. There's a really great documentary from 2008. It's called No Subtitles Necessary, and it's about the lifelong friends Laszlo Kovacs and Vilmos Zsigmond, both of whom have also since passed. The Hungarian-American cinematographers who, between the two of them, shot, Easy Rider, Paper Moon, The Long Goodbye, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and so much more. They really were preeminent cinematographers, again, from the 60s through the 90s, and Zsigmond was still working in the 2000s. If you can find it, it's really good. The cinematographer Ellen Kuras says something about these two men. She says, in her opinion, Kovacs and Zsigmond are as responsible for the look of 1970s Hollywood cinema as anybody else. And I love thinking about cinema that way, to kind of take a step away from the directors who were great, and think about the other people, the other filmmakers and craftspeople who made those films. And in the 70s, there was an explosion of talent in cinematography. Haskell Wexler, a bunch I've already mentioned, Gordon Willis, John Alonzo, Conrad Hall, oh my God. These guys, and they were all guys at the time, were using new cameras, new rigs. They had new ideas about framing, about camera movement, about what you could do, how you could shoot on location. They invented, as much as the directors, the look of 1970s Hollywood cinema, and they deserve a lot more recognition than they get. And at the top of that heap, without any question or any reserve, you can put Owen Roizman, who is, I'll say it again, quite literally one of the greatest cinematographers in American movie history. So he seems to have lived a long and good life. He was 86 years old when he passed, but it's worth noting how important he was to the films that we all love, and how important he was to creating one of the greatest decades of Hollywood cinema in history. So rest in peace, Owen Roizman. Condolences to your family. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you again soon with more What Makes This Film Great. Until next time, keep watching movies.